Hello and welcome to Criminal Governance During COVID, brought to you by the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. I'm Lindy Mtongana. In this half hour, we'll be taking a look at those parts of the world where criminal gangs and not governments are in charge. During the pandemic, states across the globe showed their strength or lack of it with financial rescue packages, vaccines, healthcare, the imposition of lockdowns, and even hitting back at organized crime. But what about those parts of the world where many states still fear to tread? We've seen criminal groups enforce their own rules and lockdowns, prohibit certain behaviors, and even punish those who do not obey. In some areas, they've restricted access to resources, taxed businesses, or provided food and other forms of support as a way of influencing the people in the territories they control. So, has criminal governance strengthened its grip during COVID? And if so, in what ways and why? To explore this, we'll hear from two former gang members, activists, and people for whom contact with gangs is part of everyday life. I'll also be speaking to some of the world's top experts on criminal governance. And the Global Initiative really wants to hear your views and your experiences of criminal governance during the pandemic. It helps inform their research. So please do get involved and become part of this conversation on social media using the hashtag #CovidCrimeWatch. But to kick us off, let's get some perspective of criminal governance on the ground and how it's altered during the pandemic.
When you go to West Point, for example, they run their own show. Even the government is afraid of that place. They move with machetes, cutlasses, knives, and guns.
They tax small businesses. They make them pay tax for protection, but essentially the protection is from them.
One of the things that they do is curtail resources. For example, they block communities from accessing transport, that is the public transport. They start controlling the transport industry. We also see them withholding essential services such as water, power, even controlling rent.
COVID created a number of opportunities for criminals. Security and criminal justice was put on pause.
Algunos integrantes de grupos que se asumen del crimen organizado han golpeado a pobladores y han difundido videos en donde por no usar cubrebocas los mismos ciudadanos son sancionados por estos integrantes del crimen organizado.
Existia, de certa forma, toque de recolher, caso a pessoa efetuasse, saísse de casa no tardar da noite, poderia ocorrer algum tipo de punição.
The sad thing is we celebrate Freedom Day every year, but nothing changes. We're not free because we don't have freedom of movement because some kind of gangs just took it away.
Some really powerful testimony there from people living at the sharp end. A big welcome now to Antonio Simpao, a senior analyst at the Global Initiative who has been researching criminal governance during COVID. Now, at the start of the pandemic, the Global Initiative launched COVID Crime Watch, an initiative which explores the impact of COVID-19 on illicit markets across the globe. Experts from the GI have provided research and analysis about a breadth of topics, including how criminal groups have exerted control in place of the government. Antonio's research is, of course, required reading for anyone interested in the subject. You can find his work, along with reports from other GI experts, on the Global Initiative website. Antonio, gangs have often been compared to primitive states. Why is that?
Thanks, Lindy. Yes, there is still a lingering impression of gangs and criminals in general as sort of juvenile delinquents or troublemakers. Sometimes people, say that criminals are led to this life out of underdevelopment or poverty, and whereas these factors are indeed very important in being drivers of individual pathways to crime, when you think about gangs as organized outlets, as organizations, they are way more sophisticated than that. Research, including our research, has documented cases in which gangs and other armed groups have come to perform really social and political roles in the local level, especially in low-income urban areas, peripheries, slums in the developing world. So in terms of this role as primitive states, it really comes down to how gangs perform sometimes, when they are really organized and well-armed, roles as providing local order or alternative orders in terms of regulating life, providing rules for the population, providing a rough form of security in terms of, you can't rob in this area, you can't commit, crimes in this area, even when gangs do commit these crimes and other things in other areas. But in their territories, they provide a rough form of security that, of course, comes accompanied by some, and in some cases, a lot of predation and exploitation, extortion to businesses and sometimes to individuals as well. So it's not they don't do that out of the goodness of their hearts, but there is a level of order and security that they provide in areas that have been essentially excluded or left out by the basic governance aspects, the services, the security that modern states have been, become associated with.
A really interesting point there from Antonio. But now let's hear from two former gang members about what they say are their roles in these so-called primitive states.
Our rules is first, you have to pay. Number two, you have to know that we own that street. Number three is even the police are below us.
We are the kings in our community. Everyone, especially our peers, really feared us. They see what you do.
I remember there was a time I had the power to go into a police station and go and tell the police, like, that guy in the cell is my staff, just remove him from the cell.
Within our boundaries, in our hood, no one will bring trouble. We'll come in and we ensure we solve the problem. To keep the peace, we'll protect them and protect the resources within our area to go directly benefit the people in our community.
We had what we call Pesa Mbwa. That was like a local tax to the public transport system. If you failed to pay us the tax, we can guarantee you by the next day nobody will be climbing your vehicle. Because anytime a client gets into your vehicle, we rob them.
We used to protect some businesses who pay us to protect them. And if we try to break there, we look for you, we beat you, and we ensure you return everything that you stole.
There was loss of lives. We could maim people, damage properties, arson, all as long as we just make the statement, you have to play by our game.
We never wanted to see the cases of rape, gender-based violence, sexual harassment, petty crimes like snatching, breaking and stealing. So that's the thing we used to enforce because we wanted to protect ourselves and community know us like leaders. Our organization is trying to empower through changing, transforming youth who are lost in drugs, crime, commercial sex work, early marriages, dropouts. So our bottom line is unifying and changing them through sports. So once we enroll them in sports, we engage them in other activities like community services. The main objective is teaching the youth the virtue of serving others and expecting nothing in return.
I've worked with over 50 youths in Kibera. 10 to 20 have been paying their school fees through their art. It's been a long journey, but I'm grateful to God and to the friends and the people who've believed in me.
Thank you to coaches and Stephen in Nairobi for talking to us about their existence in gangs and their lives now. But how do organized criminal groups adapt in times of crisis? Outside wartime, governments across the world may never have had to react so quickly and at such scale to events as during the pandemic. So what happens to people when the state can't or won't provide basic services or security? I'm delighted to be joined by Kyle Johnson now, a researcher at Fundación Conflict Responses. Kyle's work in Colombia formed part of Antonio's research project. He looked at armed groups in the port city of Tumaco, which is located near the Ecuadorian border and serves as an important node for transnational drug trafficking. Kyle, how did armed groups adapt in Tumaco during COVID? What roles did they perform that we might have expected to have been undertaken by the state?
During the pandemic, there were two main armed groups in the city, two main gangs, who actually performed very different roles. During the first maybe 6 months of the pandemic, where fear amongst Tumaco society was very high of the pandemic and of people getting sick and dying, the gangs mainly played a role of restricting movement, making sure that meetings weren't happening, making sure that parties weren't happening. People who had kind of high-risk jobs, such as taxi drivers, could not move as well. At the same time, in some specific neighborhoods, the gangs there performed no role whatsoever. They did not believe in COVID. They thought it was a hoax. And so believing it was a hoax, they did not enforce any rules at all. People could move about as they pleased. And they could even hold parties or anything like that. And so the interesting thing is that the variance in the gangs' response to COVID very much reflected how Tumaco and Tumacan society saw COVID. What is also interesting is that they gave no aid whatsoever. They didn't give out food, they didn't give out water, they didn't give out money. Basically, their role was mainly restrictive over anything.
So in those communities where the armed groups had a particularly strong degree on influence on the community and were able to impose restrictions, as you mentioned, how did this compare to those areas that were more under the government's control?
Well, I think the restrictions, according to the people we spoke to, were more effective in the areas under gang control. And this is probably just because they have much tighter control than the government has in the areas that are more under government control, should we say. Also, the punishment mechanisms of fines, threats, and the threat of being killed, which many people feared, tended to be more effective than the government, who was handing out fines and tickets, but had no way of actually getting people to pay those fines. But in the areas under gang control, where violence is common, that strong control and that threat of violence were very effective in making sure that people actually followed the rules they did impose in Tumaco.
So it's quite interesting that in Tumaco, these armed groups did not provide aid. But let's look at some pictures of aid distribution. Not what you might expect. They include the daughter of the billionaire former leader of the Sinaloa drug cartel, El Chapo. She's handing out food parcels to the poor during COVID. Drug trafficking groups have also distributed supplies in Mexican cities, and a similar, if limited, food distribution initiative was undertaken by gangs in Cape Town, South Africa. So, Antonio, to what extent do you think we should take this type of organized benevolence at face value? And to what extent should we see it as the propaganda of gangsters who in reality prey upon the same vulnerable people they profess to be helping?
I think there is an element of benevolence sometimes. For instance, in our study, we saw that in Cape Town, gangs established a very limited truce that ended up not becoming effectively, real, because it broke down very, very quickly. And it also involved some provision of food supplies to communities, but that provision came accompanied by some demands for the recipients of that aid to help the gangs move drugs and weapons.
Yeah, indeed. And sometimes that benevolence is conditional. Thank you so much to both Kyle and Antonio there. So, what role has the state played in the lives of people who live in areas controlled by gangs during the pandemic? How have police forces and governments tried to tackle the issue of criminal governance? And have their efforts improved the situation or made things worse? Let's begin by taking a look at one police response from Brazil, described by Amnesty International as completely unacceptable. This film contains some disturbing images.
Sabe com que ele está se deparando? O nível de estresse de um policial. Não estou falando só preparado fisicamente, estou falando preparado psicologicamente para esse tipo de problema, sobretudo numa situação tão complexa como uma do Rio de Janeiro.
Vida do meu amigo, justamente! Eu quero justiça!
Infelizmente, pela situação, são regiões com muita vulnerabilidade social. Você tem, principalmente em momentos de crise econômica, vamos dizer, entre aspas, um exército de reserva, né, que há muito vem substituindo as pessoas que têm morrido. Então, a morte de um ou de outro pode aparentar para o senso comum que há uma solução, pelo contrário, né? Aquelas pessoas são repostas e a população fica, violentada de duas formas. Tanto uma polícia que é muito violenta, não sabe identificar de fato quem é um criminoso e quem é um morador, e acaba cometendo uma série de arbitrariedades e violência, e isso faz com que ela perca a sua credibilidade, que é um dos maiores capitais de uma polícia numa ordem democrática.
Well, that video certainly illustrates just how complex that relationship can be between state and non-state actors. And thank you to Hobson Rodriguez there, the former deputy head of Rio's military police, for his valuable insight into that operation. Well, to discuss the role of the police further, I'm now joined by Hussein Khalid, the Executive Director of Haki Africa. It's an organization which seeks to foster the progressive realization of human rights. Hussein is a lawyer by profession. Welcome to the conversation, Hussein. First of all, what's your reaction to that video that we just saw? And I ask this from the perspective of the extent to which this represent police tactics around the world during the pandemic. In your view, did you see similar events taking place in Africa?
Yes, thank you so much, Lindy, for having me. And just to answer directly, yes, we did actually witness similar scenes in Africa. And if I may give an example of one particular incident that I followed up on in Kenya in around May. This is just like 2-3 months after the pandemic had seriously hit Kenya. And we saw an incident where the police officers are alleged to have been involved in the raid of a suspect. And in the process, a 3-year-old girl was killed. A 6-year-old boy was also killed, and a fetus. Apparently, the mother was shot in the stomach, and the bullet was lodged in the fetus, and it died. So these incidences, unfortunately, became rampant during this pandemic. Here in Kenya, the first day of the curfew, we saw people who were tear gassed, people who were trying to rush home, people who were trying to making it to the ferry so that they can beat the deadline. But even before the deadline, we saw how the police, in the excuse of enforcing social distancing, mishandled or manhandled communities and crowds of people to the extent of tear gassing women and children. So these kinds of incidences, unfortunately, were reported in a number of African countries, not just in Kenya. We saw a similar thing in Uganda. We saw similar cases, for example, in Nigeria, in places such as South Africa.
Hussein, you mentioned the police's sometimes heavy-handed implementation of curfews and social distancing rules over populations. But how did the pandemic affect the way they dealt with organized criminal groups?
Oh, yes. I think this also presented an opportunity to the police, or so to speak, to kind of, I would say, rein in on these gangs. For many, to them, this appeared to be a good opportunity to silence these gangs. I know the example of Kenya. We've seen a number of raids and attacks in different parts of the country where gangs were, raided and killed. I know of an incident where around 5 gang members were killed during the same incident. In different parts of Africa, we've read about this, for example, in Ethiopia, where we've seen these kinds of issues being reported. We've also reported similar things in the north, in Tunisia, in Egypt, and related places.
And Hussein, taking a moment to look at this now from the perspective of the police. I mean, in some instances, they're dealing with heavily armed gangs who are not afraid to shoot if necessary. So what can police actually do in these circumstances? How can they really engage in particular areas if they fear that they may be shot? Is it a case that the police are damned if they do and damned if they don't?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. It is always thrown at us as human rights defenders, when we come out and we say that police cannot use excessive force in enhancing security. It always has to be reasonable. And the question of who decides what is reasonable always comes up, And I agree that sometimes it's difficult to tell. I think for us, many of the incidences where killings were reported, eyewitnesses have come out and communicated that in a number of cases, these individuals were already arrested, they had already surrendered, they were already clearly in the control of the police, but at the same time or at the end of it all, they still ended up being killed. And unfortunately, this has been the case in many African countries. The law is clear that everyone is innocent until proven guilty by a court of law, not by the police service, not by the community, which is also at times very loud. When criminals are killed, when people come out and say this should not happen, communities sometimes support the police because they say, oh yes, they've done a good job. These are people who are causing harm to the community. They are killing people. So when police kill criminals, in most cases, you'll find that the communities support what the police are doing. And that is not right because we know the law is the law.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much. A lot of food for thought there. Hussein Khalid from Haki Africa. Well, let's turn now to the role of civil society organizations, NGOs, and activists during the pandemic. Cecilia Oliveira is a journalist and the founder of Fogo Cruzado, a crowdsourced armed violence data website. I spoke to her recently and began by asking her whether in places where there is no effective state, the role of civil society, activists, and NGOs becomes more necessary than ever.
Here in Brazil, the state has some degree of presence everywhere. But in poor neighborhoods like favela, they are coming in a militarized way, like guns blazing, and ignore needs and rights. So the NGOs try to make up for this absence of public policies and mitigate its effects. There are places where democracy has never arrived, never. So during the pandemic, many organizations come together to provide everything from food to cleaning products, masks, and informations, if the informations they need to give. So in some favelas, residents come together to explain why washing their hands and wearing masks was so important. And people were going hungry, and local community organizations put together huge food drivers and donations campaigns.
What kind of dynamic evolved between civil society organizations and criminal groups that, in a sense, control some of these areas?
In some areas, you have these people ruling the neighborhood. But when you talk about this kind of needs, they have no rule on this. So you have like collectives of journalists that live there, and you have people just doing the things that they are already doing before. But now with less jobs, less support from the government, they have to do more than they used to do. In some places, the drug dealers are part of the neighborhood. Like they were born there. The family lives there. So if they have money, they will give the money even for this. They also help with medical situations or hunger situations because they are part of this community. This not occur when you talk about militia, because militia usually are people that was not born there. So they just are there for money, so they don't care.
You run an organization called Fogo Cruzado that essentially tracks violence, particularly gun violence in Rio de Janeiro. What have you noticed over the course of 2020 and even this year?
During the pandemic, Fogo Cruzado tracked the tragic shootings of many volunteers who were caught in the crossfire while trying to help their communities. 5 of them died, and many of them during police operations in favelas. So this was common before and still common during the pandemic. Last year, a 14-year-old boy was shot indoors by a stray bullet during a police operation. This tragedy created a lot of outrage here. And these types of situation led us and other organizations to come together and ask the Supreme Court to intervene in Rio's security strategy. The Supreme Court ordered the police to suspend non-urgent operations with a high risk of violence in favelas in Rio. So this effect was clear. We had fewer shootings and fewer deaths, including police officer lives. So this is a huge change in this scenario. On the other hand, although there are fewer police operations, the lethality of those that take place, it's very, very, very high. In other words, the measure of the Supreme Court did not fundamentally change the police conduct. There were just fewer incidents.
Thank you to Cecilia Oliveira. So we've talked a lot about criminal governance during the pandemic, but where does this leave us moving forward? Are we set to see criminal governance thrive or be eroded? Well, before we discuss that, one last reminder that you too can be part of the conversation using the hashtag #CovidCrimeWatch. Now, for our final conversation, I'm delighted to be joined by Alexandra Abello-Kolak, an expert from the London School of Economics who has done extensive research on criminal governance. Alexandra, do you see longer-term implications of the pandemic and its huge socioeconomic toll for criminal governance? Has it gotten stronger?
For the last year and a half, the pandemic and also the measures that have been taken to address the spread of the virus have caused important social, institutional, psychological, and economic consequences. And for the most vulnerable communities, for the most vulnerable groups, some of these consequences have created a situation that I think we have to see as crisis of human insecurity. And by that I mean situations in which an increasing number of people are experiencing threats that are interconnected and mutually reinforcing. Threats that affect their lives, affect their surviving, their livelihoods, their fundamental rights, and also situations in which the states don't have the capacity or the credibility to protect people from these threats. So what the pandemic has caused, for example, in many of the most marginalized communities that were already experiencing the consequences of historical marginalization and already having very complex and problematic relations between these residents and state institutions and criminal organizations. What we saw, for example, is that the pandemic led to increasing loss of income that then led to food insecurity, for example. And that food insecurity meant that people were struggling to feed their families 3 times a day, that people could not afford any more basic services or even accommodation. And that led, for example, to problems of mental health that then increased the risk of suicides, for example, that also increased the risk of gender violence, interpersonal violence, even drug addictions. And all these problems interconnected have created this type of crisis, human security crisis, that make people and communities much more vulnerable to the influence of criminal organizations. So in general, if we leave unattended this context of human insecurity that the pandemic has created, this necessarily will increase the opportunities of the criminal groups to improve the power or the influence in the communities, and also unworryingly, it will reduce the possibility of delegitimizing the type of violence and coercion these groups exert on the communities to protect their businesses and their activities.
Thank you, Alexandra. Antonio, we heard at the top of the program from people who live in these communities that they face extortion, violence, intimidation, and a lack of freedom. What is the one step governments could take to improve their lives?
Governments and policymakers in general, especially in developing countries, need to understand public security as more than just deploying the police. Very often we hear and see the deployment of police operations or police officers as synonym with, doing something about security. But in fact, the challenge posed by this type of criminal governance and these deeply rooted political and social roles performed by gangs, criminal groups, and other armed groups in urban areas go very much beyond just something that can be tackled with guns and police operations. It is something that requires the state, the government, the state institutions to go into the slums, to go into low-income areas and provide governance, and including, provision of basic services, things as basic as water, sanitation, electricity, and, the basic security of citizens.
Some fascinating perspectives looking ahead there. Thank you to Antonio, Alexandra, and our other guests for taking part in this important discussion. And thank you to you, our audience, watching around the world. Now, we've only been able to touch on some of Antonio's work on criminal governance during the pandemic today, but his research examines this problem in 5 cities in the developing world. You can find out more and explore other research and analysis about criminal governance and COVID-19 from GI experts by visiting the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime's website. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.